When I set out my initial mandate for Famidaily, I decided I wasn't going to cover the non-games. But it turns out I had a lot of things in my list that weren't games, and didn't realize it, and I skipped over a few things that really should have counted. And so occasionally I've been going back to fill in those gaps. And in the case of Family Basic, I thought I was just going to be filling in a non-game. Turns out that this is a lot more complicated topic than that. Family Basic takes us back to the fundamental concept of the Famicom, a family computer. And throughout the Famicom's lifetime, Nintendo occasionally explored other options, like the online service, or the sweater patterns. Their very first attempt to expand the Famicom, though, was Family Basic, a tool to let people write their own Famicom programs. Basic, for those people fortunate enough to not be familiar with the concept, was designed as a programming language for beginners. And so throughout the 80s, you had a lot of computers, and even game consoles, that offered versions of BASIC. I cut my teeth on Commodore 64 BASIC, for example. But even by 1980, it was really obvious that BASIC was a bad tool for teaching how to program. The structure encouraged some bad programming habits, and it was pretty clunky compared to something like C. That didn't stop schools from teaching it to elementary school students, though. That's the environment Family Basic was released in. And Nintendo released a lot of versions of Family Basic. The initial one was for a special version of the Famicom that Sharp made. Sharp was in a partnership with Nintendo in the early 80s, and they made a few different special variations of the Famicom, and this one seems to be especially rare. Nintendo made their own version of the keyboard and cartridge, and released that as Family Basic. Hudson, who was also partnering with Nintendo a lot in those early days, made the language, and it turns out that in that initial release there were quite a few bugs. Nintendo quickly recalled it, and so version 1.0 of Family Basic is actually kind of rare. The most common version, which is what I have, is version 2.0a. There's also a version 2.1 that corrects one command in this, but Nintendo only sent that out to people who requested it as a warranty repair. So that one's also a bit hard to find. About a year later, Family Basic version 3 is released to store shelves, and since that was a commercial release, I'll be covering it on its own video. In the box for Family Basic, you get the cartridge, a keyboard, and a really thick manual. I'm going to go through these in turn. The thing you're going to notice on the cartridge is that there's an on-off switch. The cartridge takes two AA batteries, and when the switch is on, memory is persistent. You can turn off the power to the Famicom, take the cartridge out, take it over to a friend's house, put it in again, and there's your program. If you wanted something more permanent than that, then the keyboard had the answer. The keyboard is modeled off of the terminal keyboards of the time, and while it is a QWERTY keyboard, it's not a proper Japanese keyboard. It only has katakana, and they're not arranged in an order that's used with modern Japanese keyboards. You'll also notice that a lot of the symbols aren't placed on the same keys that you might be familiar with. The back of the keyboard has a very useful feature. Two 3.5mm jacks marked Write and Read. This is what Family Basic uses for loading and saving programs. The Famicom data recorder was just a regular cassette player, and you'd plug a line from the headphone jack on the cassette recorder to the read port on the computer, and a line from the microphone jack on the cassette recorder to the write port on the computer. Family Basic only works if you have the keyboard plugged in. It just won't do anything if it doesn't detect it. When you have the keyboard plugged in and you power on, you first get a very lengthy introduction sequence. You have to hit the space bar to have it start talking to you. Then you're required to enter your name, and then it talks to you for a bit more before you can say, yes, you would like to go into Family Basic. There are two different modes for Family Basic. A programming mode where you just type in your commands, and the background graphics mode. In the background graphics mode, you can lay out an image on the screen. You use the arrow keys to move the cursor, insert and delete to select between the tiles at the bottom of the screen, while the clear and home key cycle through which tiles you're looking at. Return cycles the palette, and the spacebar places the graphic. You hit the escape key to bring up a menu, and here you use space to select. Hitting the stop key here returns you to the main menu. So why does Family Basic need this elaborate graphic drawing system? Well, that's because the purpose of Family Basic is to make games. And I cannot understate how significant that is. The version of BASIC that you'd find on other computers rarely let you have access to a lot of the functions that were good for games. Want to draw a sprite? Make sound effects? Have your user control something with a joystick? Well, you can't do that. Computers are for serious work. Sometimes you might be able to do something, but they wouldn't make it easy. That is the exact opposite of how Family Basic worked. The giant guide they had walks you through the programming language, and the very first lesson that they give you is how to get Mario to appear on the screen. Then they teach you how to make Mario move using the joypad. And then they show you how the sound system in the Famicom works. The goal of Family Basic wasn't to let people print out their tax return, it was to let them make little games. And one of the things that they did to encourage this was to release some games written in BASIC on cassette. There were a few of these in Japan, a few books on how to use Family Basic that came with a cassette of the programs in them, but those weren't officially licensed. Hudson, on the other hand, released 3 cassettes with games, and those are official releases. None of the games are especially complex. They are, after all, partially intended to demonstrate the abilities of Family Basic for people. But some of the things on those cassettes were ports of computer games that they made. Volume 1 of the cassette releases is just games for the first version of Family Basic. Volume 2 had game tips by Takahashi Meijin on side A, and one game on side B titled Saikoro Game. The third release from Hudson came on 2 cassettes, one of which was a 99-level expansion for Lode Runner, and the other had a mix of programs for Family Basic version 2 and Family Basic version 3. Since I'm going to make a separate video on version 3, I'm going to save that cassette for next time. But that's not the end of it. An enormous hobbyist community built up around Family Basic, and they kept working with it for a decade after its release. Often, their games would be shared through magazines that they'd send their programs to. And the biggest of these magazines was MyCom Basic. As it turns out, while I was recording this episode, over 100 issues of the magazine were uploaded to the Internet Archive. There's a preservation effort that's now ongoing to get some of these Family Basic games stored for posterity. You can find them over at Gaming Alexandria. While I was working with Family Basic, I was reminded a lot why the bad old days are the bad old days. Getting anything to run on Family Basic was a challenge. You'd think it'd be as easy as connecting a computer's audio out to the Famicom's audio in, but I encountered bad media, incompatible file formats, and the analog circuits in the keyboard are not very well shielded. I spent a lot of time poking at Family Basic, trying to get a strong enough grasp to be able to write a basic game myself, and realized that if I wanted to do anything, it would take me probably about a week and a half to learn it well enough to do so. A week and a half learning Family Basic where I might be able to get in 50 lines of code, or if I really wanted to spend that time making a game for the Famicom, I could refresh myself on 6502 assembly. And a lot of the more interesting Family Basic programs are for Family Basic 3.0 only. This version of Family Basic is a really interesting historical curiosity, and a weird cultural touchpoint for Japanese computer nerds, but probably not something that you'd want to actually use.